Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is John Bristow. I'm your co-host for today. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate your time and attention for this great webinar featuring Bob Walker, our field CTO at Octopus Deploy. You are in the right place. Don't worry. This is a webinar entitled Streamlining Deployments, Lessons for Building a Paved Path for 150 plus developers. I know I'll get it right. For those who are at all curious, this is one of many webinars that we're conducting over the next, say, several weeks. So you're in the right place for this. You can check out the rest of our webinar schedule at octopus.com/webinars. Coming up, we have Alex and Ships talking about top 3 deployment patterns from experience. We've got a very popular webinar coming up on April 9th entitled Introducing the Octopus Kubernetes Agent. A lot of folks are really excited about that. As always, we have our monthly 101 featuring myself. This is on April 11th. And then wrapping up the month, we have a webinar version of our white paper entitled A Leader's Guide to Kubernetes CD at Scale. This is featuring Kit and Bob. This is on April 23rd. If you're at all curious, you can check out our white paper. It's available online. You can sign up and download it today if you're at all curious. Feel free to check that out, which is awesome. Anyways, without further ado, I'd like to thank Bob for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much, Bob.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, that is it's a bit of a mouthful when I came up with this particular title. So, thank you everyone for joining today. This is a story that I really enjoy telling because, in fact, this was my first overall experience using Octopus Deploy. That's really how I got started with this whole automated deployments process. So, before I get started, if you want to have a little bit more information about this story, I mean, the overall webinar is going to take about a half hour, 35 minutes to tell the entire story. But I leave a lot of context on the floor just for the purposes of a narrative. If you want to have any more information, please feel free to reach out to me. I have all my LinkedIn information, email, GitHub, all that other good stuff. Now, you'll notice that I've been working at Octopus Deploy since 2018. And prior to joining Octopus Deploy, I've worked for a variety of different companies. And in fact, this story comes from one of those companies that I worked at. And now I've always considered myself a developer at heart. In fact, if you ask me to fill out, what do you do for a living or what do you consider yourself, I'll still consider myself a developer. I've been a developer since 2003 when I started working on a .NET applications. In fact, my very first job was converting classic ASP websites over to .NET web applications when this brand new thing called web forms was out there, and I had to fight the view state beast, so to speak. So today I want to talk to you about how I helped create a process to go from quarterly 2+ hour deployments down to weekly 15-minute deployments. And in doing so, I'm going to share a number of different lessons on how we built this sort of paved path to help everyone else really get on board with doing this. And this is something that almost everyone within the company was adopting by the time I left. Now, this is an analogy that is focused on database deployments. And really, this can be something that can be applied to any golden path, all of these different types of lessons. So although I'm going to be talking about database deployments and you're going to hear about some of the processes that we had in place at the time, just make note that these are lessons that you can apply to your own paths in your own building out your own processes. But we need a starting point for this particular story. And this brings me to my very first lesson, which is existing processes that are out there, especially if you are starting today building out your own golden path. Oftentimes what you're going to see is a result of a series of mistakes and reactions to that mistake. One of the analogies I love to use is the boiled frog analogy, which is a frog will never jump into boiling water. However, if you place a frog into tepid water and slowly raise the temperature, the analogy goes that it will eventually not realize that it's boiling until it's almost too late. And oftentimes processes that we see and ways that we try to fix it, it's something that happens gradually over time. So I mentioned 2+ hour deployments. And this was typically a result of having 30 minutes of deployments and then 90 minutes of verification. And that verification was required because, again, we were doing quarterly deployments. So our change sets that we had out there, they were massive. We were making so many different changes. On top of that, the application that I was working on at the time was one of the most complex applications that the company had. And not only do we have a very large code base, but on top of that, we also had I want to say anywhere from 5 to 6,000 database objects. Primarily, all of them were stored procedures, but we had a lot of different tables as well. And so we spent all this time verifying it to make sure that we got all of the changes out there specifically for the database because there were so many different objects. And despite our best efforts, we always had some sort of emergency fix the next day. And when we say emergency fix, what this typically means is this is a fix that's done out of the normal deployment window between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. And it required approval from various leaders. The fixes in themselves can be fairly innocuous, such as, oh, we just forgot to update a view that's used by the data analytics team, or we forgot to update a store procedure that included an additional column or something like that. But there were always some small stupid mistake that we would make that we would have to have this emergency fix the next day. And I couldn't help myself when I started putting together this slide deck. I started thinking of this scene when I said 60% of the time it fails. This scene from Anchorman where he's like 60% of the time it works every time. And this was often a result of why we would miss these changes was a result of how we made our deployment. How we made our database changes. And what we had is we had database developers that were responsible for the overall performance, and they were the directly responsible person for the database itself. But the developers, they were also empowered to make changes to the database. It wasn't just the database developer. And so they would add a new column. And then they would also update a store procedure. And then they would tell the database developer, hey, I made this change. And the database developer, they would then put it on a piece of paper, or they'd write it in a Word document or put it on an Excel spreadsheet. How we kept track of those changes is kind of the mechanism that we did is kind of unimportant. The point is that we're doing this all and it's very manually. On top of that, how we delivered changes was less than ideal, to say the least. So we had the standard 4 environments that almost every company seems to have independently agreed upon. We had a development, test, staging, and production. You could easily replace test with QA and staging with integration, however you want to call it. But we had these 4 different environments. Now, one of the kickers is that the developers, they were sysadmins on dev and test. So they can make whatever changes they wanted to either dev or test. And this was meant as a way to speed up the whole deployment process. Now, QA, our business owners and business analysts, they would verify all of the changes in test. And this was done because getting changes up to staging and production took a significant amount of effort. Because we had our DBAs, they were making changes to staging and production. They were the sysadmins for staging and production. Now, because all of the data being generated for testing purposes was inside of test, developers, they, followed the path of least resistance. I did this, where we would make changes directly into test itself. And we point all of our local web servers and services and whatever the case may be to the test centralized database. And then when it came time to promote to staging and production, we would manually create these scripts. And oftentimes we'd use tools like Redgate SQL Compare to compare the differences and select which changes we wanted. And if we needed to make any sort of manual changes, we certainly could. But we're constantly regenerating these scripts over and over again. And then when we felt like it, we should probably update development as well. And so there's always this big delta. So the DBAs are taking a look at this and going, that is absolutely crazy. You guys are making changes in test directly with no rhyme or reason, no control process. We're going to lock this down as much as possible. And when we went to production, it was a whole manual process as well, where we would generate the Delta files and drop them into a location and tell the DBAs that you had to run it and had to run in a very specific order. And then when we went to production, oftentimes that was the very first time we ran a lot of these scripts. Or we might have run those scripts, saw an error, reran the scripts. We never really fixed the error, but we said, okay, yeah, it worked the second time, so it should be fine when we go to production. Now, this is probably where you're thinking that automation is going to be the thing that's going to solve all of this. And this is what I thought as well. This was one of the biggest hard lessons that I had to learn. I really wish this GIF was actually animated because it's really funny. But essentially what it is automating a terrible process that we have out there doesn't make it any less terrible. And I didn't really know this lesson In fact, I had this thought. It's like, okay, well, we're falling apart when we promote to staging and when we promote to production. That's where all of our problems are occurring. So let's go ahead and automate the script creation when we go to staging, and then let's automate the script creation when we go to production. That's going to solve all of our problems. Not only that, we don't even have to get any of the DBAs involved. We don't have to get anybody else involved. We can just do this on our own. And so that's exactly what I did. I was like, all right, let's solve this particular problem. It's going to solve all of the world's problems by doing this. I never stopped to think that we needed to make significant change. Because in reality, all I did is I created a machine that essentially just smacked me in the face with a pie over and over again. But I did it in an automated fashion, so automation was great and everything worked out perfectly. But I needed to make a significant amount of change, and I was afraid to make that change. I never stopped to ask the big questions, such as why on earth are we automating this step to begin with? What about this process makes a ton of sense? Why are we comparing staging to production? Is staging to the truth center for us? Why are we sending the scripts to the DBAs? Do they even understand the context as to why we're making these changes? And we ask them to review this right before we go to production. Is that the best time to do that review? Because once we make the decision to go to production, oftentimes it's like a train. That train is leaving the station whether you're on it or not. And then finally, is this the best use of a DBA's time? And almost universally, everyone agreed that what we had was an unsustainable process. But we kept trying to fix it, but we kept not asking the big questions. We kept trying to automate the wrong parts, just like I was doing. And I thought the big reason why we kept doing this was because the DBAs, they were the ones that were the meanies. They didn't want to change anything. But in reality, it was a DBA that was the person who drove a lot of this change. And I put his name up there, John Morehouse, because he's gone on record of saying that he was one of the driving forces, and he's absolutely right. If you ever had a chance to meet him, he's an absolutely lovely human being. He's very nice, very friendly, very warm. But he's a tall guy, and with that shaved head and that very long beard, when he walks around and he doesn't smile, he's rather intimidating. In fact, his original moniker, I think on Twitter, was DBA with a bat. But he was the one who pushed us forward. He was the one who's like, okay, we need to solve these problems. And we need to bring in some outside consultants to kind of help a lot of us, because we need someone to have a disinterested third party to kind of look through all of this. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up bringing in these consultants, and we had to have this 2-day meeting. But the key thing is we had representatives from various job roles present. We had the DBA, John. We also had a database architect come in, and he was the person that was responsible for setting the standards that everyone else in the company had to follow. Now, they picked me as the lead developer. I like to think this because they saw I was trying to automate things and generally make everyone's life a little bit better. But in reality, it was because the application I was working on was the most complex at the time, and the thought was, well, this is the most complex application. If we can get it to work for that, we should be able to get it to work for anything. So it was more of a case of right place, right time. The database developer on my team also joined us, and we also had a manager from another team, but he was there to make sure that we had appropriate representation from everybody. Then we focused in on identifying the key business rules to follow and the design, the process, and the responsibilities. And this brings me to my fourth lesson, which is focus on the rules first. When we drew out the process on the whiteboard, I was so hyper-focused in on like, okay, we got to automate that process, we got to automate that process, we got to fix this, we got to fix that. That's what we got to do. But instead, everyone was like, no, let's focus on the rules. What are the business rules that we want to follow? Then we can start talking about the process, and then we can start focusing on the tooling. Because do we even have the right tooling right now? Or do we need to adopt new tooling? And the business rules that we put out there, they weren't anything that was earth-shattering. Changes must be reviewed. Well, that's nothing that's new. It's new to the database, but it's not really anything new when it comes to code. And the review must be done by someone who didn't make the change. Again, that's not an earth-shattering rule. It's just more common sense. But then we started getting into some other more nuanced rules, such as we needed to have an actual truth center for our database changes, something that was auditable that we can link back to a business change request. And it couldn't be one of our database environments like dev, test, staging, or production. We needed to have a separate truth center. We also needed to have a consistent process across all of the environments, because that's one of the areas where we were failing. As you saw, we had developers that were sysadmins in dev and test, and the process that they did in dev and test was vastly different than the process we did for staging and production. So we had no idea if something was going to work the very first time we gave the scripts over to the DBAs for staging and production. So a lot of back and forth was spent because we had this inconsistent process. Once we identified the rules, then we started talking about, okay, what process changes do we want to have in place? The first one was we needed to treat our database schema like its version control, or excuse me, like our source code, and put it into source code control like Git. We should also treat the database just like a web server or a service or anything along those lines, where all the developers had their own local copy running, and then they could destroy it or do whatever they wanted to it. And all the changes that we had to be made, they had to be made on a branch, just like source control. And then we could trigger a build on each check-in to verify everything. And then we had pull requests to approve the changes. But this also meant that we had to adopt brand new tools. At the time, we were using Team Foundation version control and recognized that, okay, in order for us to have a process like this, we need to leverage Git, because it's going to enable us to have branching and to have pull requests. But we also need to have a modern build server. At the time, it was Visual Studio Team Services. It's commonly today known as Azure DevOps. And we also needed to have a consistent deployment process. And the tool that we found for that, unsurprisingly, was Octopus Deploy, where we could define a process once, and then we could reuse it for all of our different environments. But we also needed a tool to enable our database deployment, so we adopted Redgate's tooling. And by doing that, that's how we could get the full-on pull request process with a consistent process across all of our environments. And these were all significant changes that we had to do, adopting a whole new tool set, a whole new process. But when we did this, when we reviewed it with our business rules, it was pretty easy to point to all the various things of, okay, this tool does this, this is how we're enforcing it via this process, or anything along those lines. It was really easy at that point in time. And this was something that we could give to our auditors, we can give to our security people, and they could take a look at it and go, okay, yes, this makes a lot of sense. Now, it's a lot more than just these bullet points. It was actually a pretty extensive process, but high-level overview, this was something we could give to anyone, and they go, yes, this makes a lot of sense. We feel confident signing off on something like this. Then it came time to implement the changes and implement this process. So we started with a pilot group, which was my team, and then we had a few other teams also join the pilot program as well. And this is when I learned that I needed to know when to say no and when to say yes. One of the most difficult things that we had when it came to this, any sort of process that we wanted to put into place, was the fact that we were sysadmins on dev and test. And anytime we try to implement any sort of change into our process, what was happening was developers, they would follow the path of least resistance. And they would continue to go with the process they knew, and it worked for them. And so they would still make their changes in test directly, and then hopefully everything would magically work itself out. We needed to have a mechanism to enforce those changes. And so what we came up with was, okay, if you make a change in test, such as you update a store procedure, and then you say add a new column to a table, the next time we deployed a test, which was happening fairly frequently at this point, we would overwrite those changes. And I can't tell you, I'm going to guess that almost every single developer had to learn this lesson the hard way, where they would spend a few hours, an entire morning, working on a brand new store procedure, and then maybe go to lunch. They turn off all their, turn off their computer or shut down everything or whatever the case may be. They come back and all of their changes are gone. It's because they didn't follow the process. And so they'd come running over to me. It's like, no, you need to allow us to overwrite that so we can make changes directly in tests. Like, no, we're not going to do that. we need to have this enforcement. And otherwise, we're not going to have a consistent process across all our environments. And we're not even going to know if something's going to work when we go to staging for the first time. But that being said, no process is ever static. And as we started rolling out this process to a bunch of other teams, we had to make additional changes. Change for your processes is inevitable. And this was another really hard lesson for me to learn, because I thought when we walked out of that meeting room, it's like, we have a process that's going to work. I can see it working. We had a POV showing how it's going to work with all the tools, soup to nuts, everything's like, this is going to be awesome. I know it's going to work. But then as we started rolling it out to more and more teams, we started learning the tool a little bit better and started realizing, okay, this step that we have in place right here, it's a bit superfluous because it's being handled much earlier in the pipeline. So we really don't need it. But we also had unexpected use cases when we started rolling it out to other teams. They would use features of SQL Server that we didn't know existed or we never accounted for. And so we had to make a few adjustments to the process to make it work. So the big lesson that I learned here was, don't try to design this perfect process up front. Give yourself room to iterate and grow and learn the tool, because you're going to have to make these changes, and that's perfectly fine. It's always going to be, some sort of version as you learn and adjust, and there's new technologies that come on board. So those are all the lessons that I learned while I was working at that particular company. But as I worked at Octopus Deploy, this was a case where I learned something much later. And if you've ever saw the Seinfeld episode where George Costanza comes up with the jerk store comeback as he was driving home, it's almost like that, where it's like, I wish I said that. I wish I did that. As you're driving home, it's like, oh, man. So one of the lessons that I wish I learned was, I wish I learned to ask why when I was saying no to developers that kept trying to make changes directly in dev and test and not follow the process that we had in place. What was happening was if you look at this process, we make a change on the feature branch, and then we have a pull request into main, and then that's what kicks it off to dev, test, staging, and production. The difficult thing is how can we get feedback from our QA folks, from our business owners, from our business analysts with this particular process? What was happening was we had unfinished changes that were getting merged into main, just so we could have someone review something and test to start getting this faster feedback, or even development. That would have been acceptable as well. But we didn't allow that to happen. And so what developers were actually doing is they were trying to make changes in test so then they could get feedback from, have the business owner or the business analyst, have them take a look at, say, their local machine, make sure that everything looks appropriately, and then they could start doing the whole merge process. But I never stopped to ask for something like that. It's like, why are you doing this? What we needed to do is we needed to adjust the usage of our tooling. So again, if I had a magic wand and I could go back in time, this would have been the next iteration of a pipeline. Now there would have been a further iteration on this pipeline, but into having like more dynamic environments, but this would have been the next iteration where when you check into a feature branch, that automatically deploys to development. And then we could still have the rules of overriding uncommitted changes because it's much easier. I have a feature branch, I check in, it gets pushed up right away. It should be a very fast feedback cycle. And then once everything looks good in development, then we can have the pull request into main, have the automated push to test, and then continue on our process to staging and production. We'd have the same process for all of our environments. We'd still have the same rules where a change must be reviewed before it gets into main. So we weren't doing anything differently in terms of like violating any of our business rules. We just were tweaking our process. Another big lesson I wish I did, which was create demand for people to want to follow this new process by tracking key metrics. When we were rolling out this process to all the other development teams, one of the very first questions I always got was, why should we change this process? What benefit does it give me to learn this new tooling, to go through this whole heartache of learning all of this other stuff? And I wish I was tracking these key metrics: deployment time, deployment frequency, and the post-emergency fixes or failure rate, following those DORA metrics. Starting to track this and get people excited by the adopting these changes. Because when we adopted this change and after the first couple of deployments, all of the emergency releases that we had to do because we forgot some sort of store procedure or we forgot some sort of small configuration change, all of that dropped to 0 immediately. And that was a huge win for us. Being able to just basically shout it from the mountaintops, like, listen, you don't have to deal with any of these emergency fixes the next day. On top of that, the very first time we did the deployment with the new process, it actually took the same amount of time. And this is because, again, we were learning the tooling for the very first time when we went out to production. And that's perfectly fine. And that happens because there's going to be some sort of permissions thing, or there's going to be some connection that we didn't think about, or any number of those little things that always just seem to add up. But everyone was really understanding when it came down to it. It's like, yes, we understand this because we're trying to make this better by automation. The next time that we went out to production, it went a little bit faster. We didn't have the same mistakes that we had before because we had already configured everything. And then we didn't have to verify nearly as much. But then we noticed a huge change with our verification time. Yeah, we get a little bit faster with our deployments, but we didn't have to verify as much because we weren't making the same stupid mistakes over and over and over again. And so then what ended up happening was, okay, our deployment time is decreasing and we're not making these same stupid mistakes. We're starting to feel a little bit more confident with our deployments. So what became once a quarter went down to once every couple months. And then very quickly went down to once every 6-ish weeks. And then once a month. Then once a fortnight. And then once a week. And then by doing that, our change set kept shrinking more and more and more. And so by the time I left that particular company, the last deployment I did, there were only 3 people involved. It was the manager, the business owner, and myself. And we were online, and we were just chit-chatting for most of it. It's like, oh, yeah, the deployment's done. Okay, I'm going to verify it. Okay, everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Because our change sets got so small that we only were deploying maybe 3-4 things at a time. So we didn't have to verify nearly as much. And being able to shout that from the mountaintops again is like, listen, you can deploy much more frequently. You're not going to make the same mistakes. And you're going to have a higher degree of confidence that everything is going to work. This was one of those things, again, I wish I was just telling everyone, it's like, yes, this is what you're going to get when you adopt this tooling. The final lesson that I wish I learned was when you start coming up with these golden paths, the temptation is that you should be the sole owner of that process. You're the only ones that are going to come up with this, and you give them to the developers and to the various engineering teams so they can then handle all their deployments. But when you do something like that, you basically have recreated this meme where the developer goes, okay, everything works on my machine as I expect. I'm going to go ahead and throw it over the wall to this process, and it's going to handle the rest for me. I'm not going to have to learn anything at all. So don't create these black box processes. Be very transparent and collaborative with everybody. Encourage contributions. So I already talked about being transparent and posting regular updates and celebrating wins, shouting from the mountaintops, hey, we went down to 0% emergency fixes, and now we're down to 15-minute deployments. But also acknowledge setbacks, because we would try something and it would not work at all. I'm like, whoa, okay, let's not do that again. But it's okay, because you're just trying to improve things. But also be a servant leader. What I mean by that is be collaborative and have face-to-face meetings and try to get buy-in with everybody and encourage those contributions, setting up pull requests or setting up any sort of mechanism so people can go, I think it would be better if we changed this or we modified this or if we updated this step to support this. And when you do that, people feel more empowered and they're like, okay, I want to contribute to this process. But you still have a kind of a benevolent dictator that's overlooking everything and making sure that, yes, all the process and all the rules are still being followed. But it's a much more collaborative and fostering that type of contribution. And so that is it for the story for today. I was almost right on that 30 minutes like I predicted. So thank you very much for listening, and I greatly appreciate your time. If you want to learn more, go ahead and email me, or we also have some time for questions if we had any questions that came in.
No questions yet, but thanks, Bob. That was great. Again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to submit them to the Q&A pane or the chat window right now. Bob's happy to answer them live. Just to remind folks that we do have many more webinars coming up, so you're watching this one right now. But coming up, just to remind you all, we've got a few webinars on the docket here, which will be great. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions in the meantime. Looks like we'll do the one Mississippi, two Mississippi.
Yeah. All
right.
good.
Well, again, thanks, Bob.
Yep.
Really appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing with us your experience there, doing the paved path for 150 plus developers. Great stuff. And we'll see you on the next webinar. Take care and happy deployments, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.